Hi there! This is the last part of a set of videos building the environment monitoring station using Pimoroni's Enviro Plus board. In the other videos I covered the hardware, making the front cover, the software architecture and the installation procedure. In this video I want to quickly demonstrate how to use it. I don't want to spend too much time on every detail since I made a user's guide that should help with a lot of these things. I updated the guide recently in my GitHub repository, which gives me an opportunity to quickly demonstrate how you can keep the Enviro Station software and documentation up to date. This here is the original installation I showed in the previous video, which was done before the last update of the guide. So, while there is a guide in the documentation folder, it is quite short and leaves a lot of things out. To update this installation to the latest version in the GitHub repository, you just need to open a terminal in the Enviro Station folder. It's taking a bit of time because we're actually running the Enviro Station at the same time. Anyway, and then you type git pull. If we go back to documentation, we find the newer guide. If there were any software updates, those would also have been installed. By just looking at the table of content, you see there's a lot of stuff divided into 5 sections. There's a description, operation, calibration, installation, and parts list and other useful stuff for building. Building and installation already had their videos, so I'm not going over this again. I'll just cover some key parts of operations and calibrations and ask you to look up any further details in the guide. The guide and this video use this front cover as that is what I have currently installed. But will eventually moving to something like this because it makes operation a bit more intuitive. I just did not have the time to print and laminate it. Both panel designs are available in the front cover folder of your Enviro Station directory after installation on the Raspberry Pi. First, a quick explanation of what is hiding behind those 8 sensor buttons. I call these bubbles sensor groups. All those values inside each of these bubbles are treated the same. That is, if you turn on, for example, average display on a bubble, you see averages for all values in the bubble. Or for recording, you can select or deselect a bubble, which means you either record all of the values in the bubble or none. The 2 buttons on the right are for the particulate sensor. The top one shows the familiar PM1, PM2.5 and PM10 values, which are particle weights per volume of air, that is in microgram per cubic meter. The ones directly below are particle sizes per volume of air, that is diameter in micrometers per liter. Note the second button, which shows temperature, barometric pressure and humidity. The group actually contains only pressure and humidity because the BME 28 is temperature, is not ambient temperature. But I decided it's convenient for weather forecast to display temperature as well by this button. So the ambient temperature is copied in from the MCP 9808 base temperature on the left, but not actually a part of the pressure and humidity group. What this means is that if you want to see averages for all 3 values shown by this button, or record all 3 items, you need to actually enable averages or recording for temperature separately and do the same again for pressure and humidity. The last thing to note is that time isn't actually a real sensor, but a useful thing to display. Because it's not a real sensor, some of the functions don't work with this button. For example, you can't select average time because it makes no sense. Also, you can't select or deselect it for recording because it's always recorded anyway. If you are not in the menu mode, touching any of the 8 sensor buttons simply switches to display that sensor in whatever way you had previously configured it in the menu. It will display this sensor until you change it to another one. If that gets too boring, the cycle button will automatically select the next sensor for display every 10 seconds. By default, Enviro Station starts with a temperature sensor. Then we have temperature again and relative humidity and barrow pressure below, followed by the 3 gas sensors and particulate by weight per cubic meter. The system has been running continuously for 12 days, 1 hour, and it's not recording at the moment. Illuminance is just 25 lux at present. And my room is not exactly silent due to touch beep and the fans on the kit in my bench. More particulate, this time by diameter per liter. Using the cycle function, you can make Enviro Station cycle through the sensors automatically. While it's cycling, I'd like to quickly explain the design philosophy behind the way the values are shown. You notice, although the display can show graphics, I'm not doing any, for the simple reason the display is just too tiny to be useful and readable from across a room. Well, at least for me and my old eyes. That is why I try to show each value in as large a font as possible. The recording function is there if I want to do fancy graphing using a spreadsheet program. If I were to design a new station from scratch, I would use a much larger display than what's on the Enviro Plus board. A possible software upgrade I may do in the future is to implement a second graphical user interface through a small web server running on the Raspberry Pi Zero. That way you could see values graphically throughout the house on your smartphone or tablet, but that's just an idea for the moment. If you touch Shift plus one of the sensor keys, you toggle the display between the normal view as configured by the menu or the minimum and maximum value. Those minimum and maximums are the lowest or highest sensor values detected since the Enviro Station was last started or since min-max was last reset. To do the reset, you touch Shift plus the time button, which resets the min-max of all sensors. I use the time button for that since it makes no sense to show a min-max for time anyway. By pressing Shift plus the temp button, we now see the minimum temperature in the last 12 days, relatively high since the unit stood on my desk all the time. This setting affects only temperature displayed by itself. The combined display shows the current temperature. Another Shift plus temp cycles to the maximum temperature of the last 12 days. Again, the combined display is not affected. A third Shift plus temperature shows the normal display again. Of course, if we want, we can do the same for any other sensor. Now we see the lowest temperature, humidity and barrow pressure in the last 12 days, while the separate temperature display is not affected. And we can select the maximum using the same method. And back to normal. If you are in normal mode, touching menu brings you into menu mode. Touching menu again exits the menu mode. Within menu mode, next and pref functions move between the different menus. The first menu is called Unit and allows you to change units for some of the sensors as shown in the table. Of note are the gas and noise sensors, as I have discussed in the previous video on software. They allow finding suitable values for R0 in case of the gas sensor and the noise floor for the microphone. Since they use the configuration function to do that, changing the unit will reset statistics for those sensors. That is unavoidable, since it makes no sense to calculate, for example, an average of some dB SPL value and raw pulse code modulated amplitudes. For the other sensors, changing unit is just a display convention and doesn't affect the underlying statistics at all. You can see there is a sort of abbreviated help text. We are currently looking at temperature displayed in Celsius. Touch another sensor to see its unit, like millibar. Gas shows a slash to indicate it's using a ratio. Some sensors, like particulate, do not offer a choice. Same for illuminance. Sound is currently displayed in dB SPL. To change the unit, just touch Shift. Now we use Fahrenheit. It is active immediately, so on leaving menu, we see it working. There are more choices for barometric pressure. Let's select inch mercury. Now we see a display that should be kind of familiar to viewers in the US. As explained in more detail in the guide, for calibration purposes you will need to temporarily change the unit for the gas sensor from ratio to ohm. And for sound from dB SPL to PCM. This shows sound as raw PCM value from the microphone. And the 3 gas sensor measurements in ohm. The menu after unit is called average and allows you to select for each sensor whether you want to see the current measured value or the average value. Selection works by touching a sensor, which then shows the current selection. Touching Shift then toggles that value. The other menus for trend, trend history and so on work exactly the same way. To indicate that the value on the display is average and not the current measured value, the unit shows in green. Before demonstrating, I just want to quickly explain the color coding. With all these different modes to select, it is easy to get confused what you are actually seeing on the display. But if you study this graph, you see it's actually not too difficult. We have seen the standard font already, which means we are looking at currently measured values at most 1 second old. I have also shown you the maximum and minimum displays where both values and units are shown either in all red or all blue. If we switch to see averages, the unit font will change from white to green. I am using a moving average based on exponential averaging as discussed in the software video. You can regard this like the average over roughly the last hour. If we enable trend, the value itself can change color. If the value is shown in red, the trend is rising. If it is shown in blue, it is falling, and in a steady case, the value would be again white. Of course, you could have both average and trend enabled, in which case you see the value part in the trend color and the unit part in green. As a quick demonstration, I turn average display on for barometric pressure and humidity, and in addition enable trend display as well. The result produces this display. We see the temperature is the current value because the unit is white. Humidity and pressure are both average values because their units are green. Humidity is currently falling while pressure is on the rise. This is based on the default trend history of 1 hour. By chance I had the camera rolling while the barometric pressure trend switched from rising to falling. This could be caused by just a tiny change. For now that's not yet visible in the value itself. But this gives me an opportunity to show the trend history. So far the trend was using a history of 1 hour, so compared with 1 hour ago the trend has just turned from rising to falling. Let's see if we change it to 1 day. And we are back seeing a rise. That means 24 hours ago the pressure was definitely lower than it is now, even though it has dropped when compared with just an hour ago. Maybe we are now curious to see how the pressure continues to evolve and want to turn on recording. For this we advance the menu to the Rec Val screen. Here we select the current value, that is, just measured values, which we want to include in the recording. We want the current value of temperature. But maybe not the current value of pressure and humidity, so those remain off. Advancing to the Rec Av screen, and here we enable the recording of average values for pressure and humidity. Just for fun, I also enable the recording of average values for PM values and illuminance and noise. Using Shift to select the recording time, I choose to update the recording file with a new entry every 10 seconds. To actually start the recording, you have to be out of the menu and press the Rec button. You can switch to the time display to check, and indeed it shows that we are now recording. Of course, to do any recording you must have a USB stick plugged into the USB port using an OTG adapter. After leaving it running for a few minutes, I turn the recording off by pressing Rec again. This also dismounts the USB stick. This is how the recording file we just did looks like when opened in a spreadsheet program. This is LibreOffice Calc 6.3, but it looks and behaves very similar in Excel. On the top you have elapsed time in seconds, temperature in Celsius, and the V indicates it's the current value. As you can see, the rest all have A for average. We have pressure, humidity, the 3 particulate values, and finally illuminance and noise. Note that because we recorded averages, for example the PM values are now no longer integers, while of course the sensor itself always reports integer counts of particles. You may be surprised that the seconds do not start with 0. The column shows in fact the number of elapsed seconds since the Enviro station was started. The idea here is that a continuously increasing number makes it easier to append recordings. For example, you may want to record noise over a week, but only during certain times of the day, simply by using the Rec function to turn recording on and off when needed. Using the continuous seconds, it becomes quite easy to stitch the recorded files together and graph or analyze them as one. If you need the values to start from 0, you can easily create a new column with each of these values minus the first value. If you are interested in what time and date each row actually correlates to, you can figure that out too, because each recording file has the date timestamp when recording was started as part of its name. Anyway, we came here to have a quick look at the temperature, pressure and humidity. We can select the columns and pick an XY scatter graph. Because the values are so different in magnitude, let's use 2 different y-axes so we can have different scaling for pressure and the rest. Well, this clearly confirms the downward trend of pressure, although it appears to stabilize right at the end of our recording file. More difficult to see, there's also a slight downslope for humidity. The last thing I want to cover is sleep, which is actually a misnomer as the Enviro station never sleeps. Sensor polling, statistics and recording are still going on in sleep mode. Sleep is actually a screensaver. Originally, I simply turned the display backlight off, and that code is still there but disabled at present, because it was impossible to see from afar if the station was actually running at all, leading to me accidentally turning the power off a couple of times. So now it actually shows a dim star moving horizontally over the screen. Whether the screensaver is on and at what time is selected in the sleep menu. Being close to the end of the menus, it is faster to use the pref button moving in reverse to reach the sleep menu. These are the choices. I select 30 seconds so we don't have to wait too long. The screensaver has now kicked in. You can press any button to wake it up or use the proximity sensor like here. Well, and that is all I have for now. Thanks for watching.